Great. So I'm happy to chair this session, the public session of today's gathering. And it's my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today. Ursula Heise is the Marcia Howard Professor of Environmental Studies in the Department of English at the Institute of the Environmental and Sustainability at UCLA. She was a Guggenheim Fellow in 2011, the same year that she was the president of ASLE, the Association for the Study of Literature and Environments. Her research interests and teaching focuses on contemporary literature, environmental culture in the Americas, Western Europe and Japan, literature and science, globalization theory, and media. The books include Chronoschisms, Time, Narrative, and the Postmodern with Cambridge University Press, Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, The Environmental Imagination of the Global, fascinating book, in 2008, as well as a book in German. Her new book, which is coming out in 2016 with the University of Chicago Press, is Imagining Extinction, The Cultural Meanings of Endangered Species. So it's my honor to welcome Ursula Heise. Please.
Thanks so much, Chad, and thank you to Tobin and Rosie Braidotti for inviting me to be part of what's been already a truly fascinating set of discussions this morning. And I hope that what I have to say about the kind of research that I'm doing will help in some way to clarify some of the issues around green citizenship. So my research for the last couple of decades has been focused on eco-criticism and environmental humanities, and I come at that from the perspective of comparative literary and cultural studies. So the main question sort of that I've been doing turns around is how we can understand environmental issues from a matrix of cultural, social, and historical differences. And in that context, I tried a few years ago in the book that Chad mentioned to think about what an ecologically grounded cosmopolitanism might look like. My more recent work on biodiversity, endangered species, and conservation has forced me to think about species differences in addition to cultural ones. And that's then led me to think about some of the political tensions in which ecological conservation has developed over the last few decades, which in turn entails questions of decision-making and justice that I'd like to discuss with you today. And there's two tensions that I've been particularly interested in. One is the conflict between animal welfare, animal rights, on one hand, and conservation on the other. And the second one is the conflict between conservation and environmental justice. I'll mention the first one just briefly, although it is important in ways that you will see. And then I'll focus on the second one a little bit more to make the bridge to citizenship. So animal welfare and animal rights movements share with environmentalism the concern for non-human species. But animal welfare advocates typically focus on individual animals and mostly on domestic and farm animals, and then the wild animals that are used in scientific research and for entertainment. Conservationists, by contrast, tend to focus not just on animals, but also on plants, fungi, corals, microorganisms, and they typically privilege the welfare of species and ecosystems over that of individual organisms. Now, what underlies these two different perspectives, and this would be one way of looking at it, is a difference in how citizenship is understood once it reaches across the boundaries of species. Animal welfare, and I'm putting this a little bit simplistically here, but animal welfare, I think it's not unfair to generalize, typically seeks to bring animals into the purview of some kind of citizenship. It advocates for legal protection for most animals and even certain rights for some kinds of animals like primates. The literary scholar and philosopher Kerry Wolf, and he builds on Jacques Derrida's work in that respect, has insistently sought to bring animals from a space outside the law, where their mistreatment and killing can, for the most part, not be legally punished, to consideration within the law. So that's sort of the animal welfare take on this. Environmentalists, by contrast, and again I have to generalize here from a huge panoply of perspectives, at least in the tradition of the American conservationist Aldo Leopold, has usually made the converse move. It's sought to make humans citizens of a political entity that goes beyond human society as it's usually understood. And so Leopold, in his well-known formulation of the land ethic, says all ethics so far evolved rest upon a single premise, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, water, plants, and animals, or collectively, the land. A land ethic, of course, cannot prevent the alteration, management, and use of these resources, but it does affirm their right to continued existence, and at least in spots, their continued existence in a natural state. In short, a land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. So if animal welfare typically seeks to make non-humans citizens of the human community, environmentalism seeks to make humans citizens of an ecological community, at least in this strand of it. Now, in practice, the two movements have often coincided, say in protests against sealing in the 1970s, or currently in their critique of the conditions of meat production and factory farming. But in other cases, they have diverged and continue to diverge in hunting, for example, or in what should be done with invasive species. So animal welfare advocates sometimes accuse environmentalists of not caring enough about animals. And by that, they mean individual animals. Environmental justice advocates, sort of as a compliment, have often accused conservationists of caring too much about animals and not enough about disempowered humans. Starting in the 1980s, environmental justice advocates protested against efforts to conserve endangered species with little regard to how this conservation would affect people living in the conservation areas. And those are, of course, often powerless and poor communities who were at risk of being displaced or losing their means of subsistence because of conservation. So a lot of efforts to establish wildlife refuges and national parks in Africa, Asia, and Latin America endangered local populations in that way. And so a first step was sort of pointing out that certain kinds of conservation were perpetuating colonial methods in that way. And then in the 1990s, environmental justice advocates also called for the recognition of environmentalisms that had emerged from the struggles of communities in the global south. And those were mostly struggles for the means of subsistence. And quite different in their character, or as that was at least the theory, from the major orientations of environmental movements in the global north, which focused mostly on leisure rather than work experience of nature and on an aesthetic rather than functional appreciation of nature. So in work that many of you are probably familiar with, the sociologists Ramachandra Guha and Joan Martinez Allier called this the environmentalism of the poor. Conservation organizations today are far more conscious of these differences than they used to be, and in many cases they're careful to address them. A lot of conservation projects today, not all of them, but many, involve extensive consultations with all stakeholders in the area and the species and in the resources affected. But a lot of the overarching questions, nevertheless, have not gone away. Who funds conservation and why? Why should large amounts of money be devoted to the preservation of animals and plants rather than to lifting people out of poverty? Who decides what local spaces and species should look like in the future? Who decides who should use them and why? How do we think about questions of ethics in the context of other humans and of other species? And so these are the questions that I'd like to address, first by way of my being a literary scholar and scholar of narrative, through two narratives, and then in the last part of my talk in a more theoretical vein. So the two narratives are a graphic novel called Virunga, and then a conventional, by which I mean print novel, that is by now well known, called The Hungry Tide by the Bengali author Amitav Ghosh. And I'll analyze them with a view toward what I'm going to call multi-species justice in the last section of my talk, and that's a concept that I hope will then help to frame environmentalist thinking about citizenship and what that involves. So Virunga was collectively authored by a group of students who formed part of the Stanford University graphic novel project in 2009. Now, the use of the comic book as a tool for reflection on serious and actually mostly traumatic events isn't new. Comic strips in their long narrative variant, the graphic novel, have been used as media for storytelling about large-scale historical events from Hiroshima to the Holocaust for half a century now. Virunga continues this tradition of experimentation, but it engages with violence that involves both humans and other species. So Virunga is set in the eponymous national park in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's famous for Dian Fossey's seminal work with mountain gorillas, but then also for its role, more recently, as a destination for refugees during the Rwandan genocide in the 1990s, and as a central area of military confrontation during the Kivu War, mostly between 2004 and 2008, though it sort of keeps going on. And I should note that this is actually the conflict that has caused the greatest number of casualties since World War II. There's 5 million people that have so far died in a war that barely registers, I think, in the media in Europe and North America. The plot of this novel focuses on an 11-year-old girl, Malika, who lives in a refugee camp in the park with her aunt and uncle after her parents have been killed. She's herself a bit of a budding comic strip artist, loves to watch and draw the gorillas, and in the process she comes to know some of the park rangers. That includes a woman ranger named Esther Ilingo, who has lost her husband and been gang raped in the violence. Esther passes strategies for dealing with violence as well as some of her drawing techniques onto Malika, and all of this happens against a background of gradually increasing tension between the park rangers and a rebel group led by a guy named Chairman Sakombi, as well as another militia group, the Mai Mai. So Malika comes as close as the novel gets to an innocent character. Some of the most striking portrayals of nature in the novel occur during her runs through the rainforest. You can see here sort of the detailed close-up shots of worms, animals, a gun too. There's that as part of the landscape, but also then a termite burrowing, the sort of a cross-section of a termite mound. All the other characters and groups in the novel are morally ambiguous. Malika's uncle, a refugee, Uncle Henry, who's in the refugee camp, runs the camp's charcoal production. That involves destroying old-growth forests that the park rangers desperately try to preserve. But at one point, the rangers strike a deal no longer to interfere with Chairman Sakombi's transport and distribution of the charcoal on the region's rivers and roads. And I mean, that's a deal that runs counter to their overall goals, but Sakombi commits himself in return not to capture or kill any mountain gorillas, and they decide that that's a more urgent conservation priority. But one of Sakombi's men, Jembe, does end up killing a whole gorilla family in a just willful shooting incident. Even he doesn't really come across as a villain. Jembe used to be one of Malika's friends before he was drafted into Sakombi's rebel group as a boy soldier. He himself is killed in a shootout with the Rangers and comes across as more a double victim than a villain. Full hostilities between the Rangers and Sakombi's group erupt when the Rangers realize that the militia have kidnapped 3 young girls, friends of Malika's, to use as sexual and domestic slaves for the rebels. That abduction breaks the deal in the Rangers' minds, and one of them then also dies in the ensuing confrontation, so there's casualties on both sides. Now, when you hear about this just plot summary, this event summary, it might tend to turn Chairman Sakombi into the novel's villain. And indeed, in the first frame in which you see him in the novel, which is this one at the bottom, he is shown sitting thuggishly sprawled on a claw-footed chair in the midst of looted UNESCO supplies, wearing sunglasses, a cane with an ominous-looking eagle's head, and enormous boots stretched out toward the observer. That's a classical way of representing evil guys in comic books. And some readers might cringe at the way he invokes God to justify keeping women from doing men's business, and also to refuse engaging with the problem of endangered species. When one of the rangers points out that the gorillas are the last of their kind, he says, "You are not their protectors. Only God chooses who will live and who will die." But even Sakombi has motivations that readers may well sympathize with. He points out that the rangers disrupt the trade in charcoal, without which people cannot cook or eat. And he directly raises questions of environmental justice. So he says, "You say you protect the animals from the people, but who protects the people from corruption and starvation and disease? I know that last year you inoculated the gorillas, but do the people get the shots? Where are the forces to protect the people? I'll tell you, we protect the people. Without us, women and children have no meat for dinner and no fuel to cook with." And one of his soldiers similarly claims in an encounter with Malika that we work against this corrupt government to return the land to the people. So these kinds of arguments make it clear that the species conservation projects in the national park are deeply embroiled in national politics, and that they're not above ethical questioning on either side. And the rangers are not heroes beyond reproach. In fact, one of them was a poacher before he became a ranger. So the Stanford graphic novel project here tries to place conservation efforts and the concern with charismatic primates into a context of violent international interventions to lay hold of resources like diamonds, uranium, iron ore, coal, and coltan. That's a mineral that's used in the production of electronics. And it also places it into the sustained military violence after the Rwandan genocide. Why and how do we conserve species beloved by the publics in the global north? And how are these efforts inflected by local politics? That's the central question that Virunga revolves around. Formally, different drawing styles highlight how non-human nature reaches human perception through filters that vary by culture, community, and individual. So for example, you get pictures of gorillas in a Rebel's digital camera, which is at the bottom here. And so these photos are, of course, rendered as drawings in the graphic novel. You compare these with Esther Ilingo's scientific drawings of gorillas in her field journal. And then you get Malika's very childlike sketches of mountain gorillas. All of these, modeling gorillas differently as objects of commerce, of scientific study, or of awakening curiosity. Esther also has these schematic drawings of the gorillas' noses, which function as sort of fingerprints by which the rangers identify them. They visually resemble the characters of a foreign script or abstract ornament and suggest that the gorillas might also be read as a sort of text that is susceptible to different interpretations and translations, of course, by different observers. And you get an example of that when Malika observes that one of Esther's gorillas looks sad in her notebook, and she insists, no, they're happy and at play, which then leads Esther to think to herself, Malika has never, this is at the top here, I don't know how well you can read this since the print is relatively small, Malika has never seen them suffer from tuberculosis or bleed out from Ebola. She hasn't seen a new male kill all the infants or attack the juveniles, or the way they all scatter when a silverback dies. And you can see how these memories of hers are accompanied by a black frame and then a drawing style with pencil strokes that make them appear like stone figures. So the question here of what the drawings show is the moods of the gorillas, which is what Malika sort of claimed, or the moods and the cultural frameworks of the observers becomes undecidable. Speaking animals, which are a staple of comic books, appear only twice in Virunga. In the first chapter of the novel, Esther suggests to Malika that if anything horrible were done to her, and she's clearly thinking of injury or rape, she should not try to remember people's faces, but close her eyes and imagine a weaver bird instead. That bird promptly appears in the next few frames, and the sequence closes with the images I've put on here, Esther and Malika mirrored in the weaver bird's iris. So if Esther first imagined the bird, here the weaver bird ends up containing the human figures. And that weaver bird reappears later as a speaking figure who encourages Esther to leave her pain behind and engage anew with her life. So Esther's imagination of the bird at that point seems to take on a life of its own. But all encounters between humans and animals, whether they're real or imagined or remembered, are overshadowed by memories or anticipations of violence. Let me give you another example of this. Malika has gone on one of her usual runs through the forest, and she unexpectedly happens upon a mountain gorilla. So you get a full-page image showing the gorilla in the foreground, and Malika in the background watching from among these tall grasses. But then a slender vertical panel that is embedded into this page-sized drawing shows the right side of Malika's face and her wide-open right eye in close-up. So it's a bit of a surrealist juxtaposition of different camera zoom views that foregrounds her perception, as well as then a different view of both her and the gorilla that might represent somebody else's gaze. We don't know yet at this point. On the following page, you have a central unframed image that shows sort of a forest road, gorilla on the left, Malika on the right. So it's sort of the same scene, but looked at from another angle. To the top of the central panel, you get three smaller vertical panels that echo the previous face. The previous page. They show the right side of the gorilla's face with the animal's eye really alert and wary, and the left side of Malika's, her eyes still open in surprise and astonishment, and then a close-up of the gorilla's hand in between. At the bottom, you get four smaller horizontal panels that show, again, the gorillas and Malika's faces, but this time in their entirety, so at a greater remove, and two views of the encounter scene, so that you can probably make this out. So these two images are, again, they're essentially the same scene as the central panel in the middle, but zoomed out from a greater distance. This intricate juxtaposition of different eyes, different gazes, and different viewing positions emphasizes the relativity of perspectives. And that's right before Malika sits down and then starts to draw the gorilla, as if to emphasize that this is what the comic book is about. And then almost immediately, one of Sakambi's men appears. And he has a camera. He's been taking photographs of the gorillas in preparation for shopping their images to potential buyers. And so that, of course, retrospectively opens up the possibility that these zoomed out and zoomed in images on the previous pages were in fact seen through his digital camera. And even though the rebel in this particular scene intends no violence toward Malika, nor at least immediately toward the gorillas, the threat of poaching retrospectively hovers over what looked at first to be Malika's just one-on-one encounter with a gorilla. So what look at first sight to be some of the most striking and almost surrealist juxtapositions in Virunga turn out in hindsight to have only two real implications of surveillance and violence. And there's another set of images that I think makes this clear in very beautiful ways. One is from near the beginning, the other from very near the end of the novel. They both show a panoramic view from the national park, and they're obviously copied from photographs of Virunga National Park. The only difference is that in the second image at the end, you have two tiny human figures, whereas the other had no human presence and no signs of human presence, no houses or anything else. One figure is lying dead on the ground. This is Njembi. The other man bends over him with concern, and there's a gun lying next to them. And there's probably nothing that drives home quite as forcefully in the novel as these two images, that there simply isn't any approach to nature that doesn't have to include violence in some way. Now, in the last chapter, Malika escapes to Kinshasa on a UN truck, and in her new urban life, she develops her drawing skills to create a comic that's embedded into the main story. That comic book, this comic book within the comic book, functions as a utopian countervision to the pervasive deprivation, suffering, and violence on the part of both humans and non-humans in the main plot. It features also the second appearance of speaking animals, this time gorillas, used more conventionally as speaking comic book animals. Now, that conclusion does not, of course, offer any realistic vision of what a political solution to the complications of the plot might look like, and it's a tall order. It does, though, affirm a dual role for the graphic novel as both a documentary genre for current crisis, a la Joe Sacco, perhaps, and a medium for envisioning possible alternatives. But I think the main achievement of Virunga may not even lie in what it envisions or refuses to offer us as a political solution. Its main achievement, I think, lies in its emphasis on the imbrication of endangered species conservation with political, sexual, and economic violence. How do we create just living conditions for humans as well as non-humans? Whatever an environmentally just Democratic Republic of the Congo might look like, Virunga suggests, that kind of justice will need to be built from the different stories and the different cultural and economic investments of local residents, refugees, rebels, militias, governments, transnational organizations such as the UN, conservation organizations, and so forth, but also from the story specifically about the non-human species that inhabit the area. So these conflicts between protection of the poor and conservation of endangered species are equally prominent in Indian-born novelist Amitav Ghosh's The Hungry Tide. Hungry Tide is published in 2005. It's set in the tidal mangrove forest of the Sundarbans in the Bay of Bengal in the early 2000s. And I've put the satellite image of the Sundarbans on here because the novel early on describes the wetlands as Shiva's hair. And it's a mythological image that oddly you realize what it means when you look at a satellite image. So that novel brings together three protagonists: Piali Roy, an American biologist of Indian descent who visits the area to do research on a rare kind of river dolphin; Kanai Dutt, a Delhi businessman and translator who comes to pick up papers that his deceased uncle Nirmal has left for him; and Fakir Mandol, an illiterate fisherman who becomes Roy's guide in her search for the Irrawaddy dolphin. So Pierre Roy and Fakir Mandol take on pretty familiar roles in, as far as sort of post-colonial and ecological novels go. So you have the scientist and the native guide, scientific expertise and local knowledge, literacy and orality, and personal histories of different kinds that open windows onto broader political and economic histories. And when you think about Roy's and Mandol's complementary kinds of expertise on the sea and its creatures. So you have, Roy, who's a cetologist, and then Mandel, who has daily observations and experiences as a fisherman. You'd expect that issues of environmental justice would come up around the quest for the endangered dolphins in the novels present in the early 2000s, but they don't. And this is really odd about this novel. Instead, the conflicts and convergences of biological conservation and social justice mostly revolve, at least at first sight, around the Bengal tiger, another highly endangered species. And they unfold in part, at least, by way of memories. So Kanai Dutt finds that the packet of papers his uncle has left for him does not contain poems or essays, which is what he expected, but instead a journal written in 1979, shortly before Nirmal's death. The journal recounts some of the events leading up to a massacre that's well known in Indian history, a massacre of refugees that took place on an island in the Sundarbans in May of 1979. And the history of that massacre is that in 1978, a group of refugees from Bangladesh had been relocated to a camp in Madhya Pradesh, so a different state, and they had fled to the Sundarbans, so sort of close back to the border of Bengal, because of the camp's desperate conditions and the hostility of the surrounding communities. They arrived at the island of Morj Champi, cleared the land for agriculture, and began to fish and farm. But now, the problem was that area had actually been designated as part of the Sundarbans Tiger Reserve in 1973 and had been declared a wildlife sanctuary in 77. And so the Indian Left Front Ministry saw the settlement as an alarming first encroachment on protected land and feared that this might be followed by other encroachments. And so it cracked down brutally on the refugees, cut them off from outside supplies, and finally evicted them. And the estimate is that about 4,100 families, so thousands of people, were killed either as a consequence of the blockade and eviction, either through starvation, disease, police shootings, or accidents during the transit back to camps. Now, Ghosh fictionalizes these events through an account in Nirmal's journal, and the idea is that Nirmal sympathized with the refugees and went to visit them and was a little bit in love with one of them, Kushum. Now, Kushum, who's one of the refugees, articulates clearly the inhumanity that she perceives in privileging the well-being of animals and plants over that of humans. So she says, and so Nirmal quotes her, and Kanai Dutt reads his uncle quoting Kushum, so it's again a play with embedded narratives. The worst part was not the hunger or the thirst. It was to sit here helpless and listen to the policemen making their announcements, hearing them say that our lives, our existence, were worth less than dirt or dust. This island has to be saved for its trees. It has to be saved for its animals. It is a part of a reserve forest. It belongs to a project to save tigers, which is paid for by people from all around the world. Every day, sitting here with hunger gnawing at our bellies, we would listen to these words over and over again. Who are these people, I wondered, who love animals so much that they're willing to kill us for them? Do they know what is being done in their name? Where do they live, these people? Do they have children? Do they have mothers, fathers? As I thought of these things, it seemed to me that this whole world had become a place of animals. And our fault, our crime, was that we were just human beings, trying to live as human beings always have, from the water and the soil. No one could think this a crime unless they have forgotten how humans have always lived, by fishing, by clearing land, by planting the soil. So, really sort of a acerbic indictment of international conservation as well as the national police force. That's here combined with an invocation of sustainable uses of nature, which Kushum sees as human universals. And it's, of course, a real irony that in a novel about endangered species, actually one of the people would see the world as a place for animals, right? So you could say that what's being foregrounded here is that there's, through Kushum's perspective, that there's sort of two biopolitical objectives on the part of the nation state that produce displacement and death for the poor. So on one hand, the attempt to contain and police refugee populations, a very current problem, of course, a lot of places in the world. And on the other, the goal to maintain control of natural resources. And that included, as historians have pointed out, not just the Bengal tiger, but also plantations that had already started on Morj Champi Island before the refugees arrived. And so it wasn't by any means a pristine wilderness, in other words. Now, through Nirmal's account of the Morj Champi blockade and massacre, the reader is clearly invited to sympathize with Kushum. Her indictment of tiger conservation functions in counterpoint, though, with another incident in the novel in which the three protagonists, and this time this is set in the narrative present of the early 2000s, witness how enraged villagers burn a live tiger to death because it's attacked and killed 2 village residents. Roy is outraged by what she perceives as a meaningless act of destruction. This is an animal. You can't take revenge on an animal, she protests. And Dutt and Mundell try to keep her from going physically into the fray to defend the tiger. And in the end, they sort of have to carry her physically off the scene to prevent her from not herself becoming an object of the villagers' rage. The incident produces a break in Roy's emergent synergy with Mundell. She's not just horrified by the burning itself, but also what she sees as his complicity in it. That sympathizes with her emotions to some extent, but then he also meditates on the problem of social justice that her outrage begins to raise. And he says to her, you know, I mean, aren't we a part of the horror as well, you and me and people like us? That tiger killed 2 people, and that was just in one village. It happens every week that people are killed by tigers. How about the horror of that? If there were killings on that scale anywhere else on Earth, it would be called a genocide. And yet here it goes almost unremarked. These killings are never reported, never written about in the papers. And the reason is just that these people are too poor to matter. We all know it, but we choose not to see it. Isn't that a horror too, that we can feel the suffering of an animal, but not of human beings? Because we're complicit in this, because it was people like you who made a push to protect the wildlife here without regard for the human costs. And I'm complicit because people like me, Indians of my class that is, have chosen to hide these costs, basically in order to curry favor with their Western patrons. It's not hard to ignore the people who are dying. After all, they are the poorest of the poor. This is a bit clunky, not in terms of what it says, but who says it, because that sort of indictment of elite indifference to the poor is a bit implausible from the mouth of this particular character. Kanai Dat, for most of the novel, is a super macho, smugly self-satisfied, and only too happy to embrace the class privilege that the novel associates with urban professionals. But that argument, of course, resonates with Kusham's perception that conservation and concern for animals are elite privileges that ignore the needs of the poor. Now, Roy responds to that attack on conservation by staking out a different political perspective. She says, just suppose we cross that imaginary line that prevents us from deciding that no other species matters except ourselves. What'll be left then? Aren't we alone enough in the universe? And do you think it'll stop at that? Once we decide we can kill off other species, it'll be people next. Just the kind of people you're thinking of, people who are poor and unnoticed. And this is interesting because it's not the argument you'd expect. I mean, what you'd expect Roy to say is that, oh, top predators like tigers matter crucially for the ecosystems that they inhabit because they keep herbivores in check who would otherwise proliferate and wreak havoc on the local plant life, and that in turn would impoverish the ecosystems that precisely the humans in the region depend on. That's not the argument that she makes, though, although that's a common one. Instead, she relies on an argument that some post-humanist philosophers and post-colonial eco-critics have made, namely that the same structural logic underlies violence against poor humans and against non-humans. It's the disdain for non-human life that ultimately enables violence against human lives that can always be categorized as less than fully human in this argument. And that's been made by Carrie Wolf as well as by Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin and others. So where Cusham and Dott see conservation pitted against the interests of the poor, Roy sees them as convergent in terms of their underlying political logic. And I think it's one of the strengths of Ghosh's novel that it presents both of these points of view with nuance, seriousness, and even passion. And it doesn't invite readers easily to dismiss either viewpoint. Now, in terms of how it pans out at the end, Fokir Mandal dies in a cyclone, but Pia Roy returns to the Sundarbans after an absence to pursue what she has come to identify as her life's vocation, the exploration of the Irrawaddy dolphin. So the tigers move off stage toward the end of the novel, and it's Roy's dolphin research that opens up what perspective for the future the novel offers. And so this is kind of interesting in terms of plot architecture here. Why does the novel engage readers in the lives of two quite different endangered species? In other words, why not just focus on the tigers, since that seems to be what the most passionate discussions revolve around? The hungry tide does devote an inordinate amount of time and plot space to the taxonomy and behavior of the Irrawaddy dolphin, as well as to the history and behavior, history of its discovery and identifications. And there's also, a lot of detail on Roy's procedures for finding and studying the dolphins. So if the episodes involving Bengal tigers give rise to some of the most spectacular and most violent conflicts in the Hungry Tide, the dolphins generate a lot of narrative material that concerns ordinary details of science, history, and everyday work. And as these details unfold, symbolic meanings build up around the dolphins that are to some extent the opposite of those that cluster around the tiger. The history of the scientific study of Gangetic dolphins and Irrawaddy dolphins, the two species that inhabit the Sundarbans, is studded with misidentifications and misunderstandings, as well as simple ignorance. From the beginning, as Roy at one point tells the story to Kanai Dutt, the Irrawaddy dolphin was either not recognized as a species of its own or misidentified as another species of dolphin or entirely another kind of creature. Its name had to be changed several times, specimens had to be relabeled, and so forth. Dolphins were kept even by scientists who didn't know what they were or basic features of their anatomy and behavior. And Roy herself narrates how in her research on the dolphins in various regions of Asia, she shows local fishermen cards with different drawings of dolphin species to prompt them to identify which ones they might have seen, because she doesn't speak any of the local languages. But one of her informants in the Sundarbans at the beginning of the novel initially misunderstands the drawing of dolphin as one of a bird. So the story of humans' encounters with cetaceans, as the Hungry Tide tells it, is one of changing perceptions, perspectives, images, understandings, and taxonomies, including misunderstandings and mistaken identifications. And that's sort of a direct analogy, I think, to the technique that you find in Virunga of presenting the gorillas with all kinds of different drawing techniques. But the dolphin story is also one of surprising symbioses and synergies. During a research trip to Myanmar, Roy observes how the dolphins help drive swarms of fish into the nets of local fishermen, and then in return the dolphins eat the fish that the nets drive to the river bottom. Did there exist a more remarkable instance of symbiosis between human beings and a population of wild animals, Roy wonders? And when she goes to explore the Sundarbans aboard Mandol's boat, she at one point asks him to take her across a certain stretch of river in sort of straight back and forth lines and sort of a zigzag, so she can gather particular kinds of data about the dolphins and hydrological data. In the meantime, Mandol uses the same trajectory exactly to line fish for crabs with his son. Roy reflects on that synergy. It was surprising that their jobs had not proved to be utterly incompatible, especially considering that one of the tasks required the input of geostationary satellites, while the other depended on bits of shark bone and broken tile. But that it had proved possible for two such different people to pursue their own ends simultaneously, people who could not exchange a word with each other and had no idea of what was going on in one another's heads, was far more than surprising. It seemed almost miraculous. And when her glance happened accidentally to cross Fokir's, she saw something in his expression that told her that he too was amazed by the seamless intertwining of their pleasures and their purposes. And another such prospect of synergy opens up at the end of the novel after Mandol's death, when Roy returns to the Sundarbans, this time to stay for good, and to continue her scientific investigation with the help of funding from American conservation organizations. The fundraising will allow her, this is what she proposes, to involve local fishermen, as well as Mandol's widow, Moina, to provide them with additional income and eventually to provide a college education for their son. For me, home is where the Orcaella are, she declares, and sort of makes the dolphins the anchoring point for a project that will combine science, conservation, and social justice in her vision. So looking at it sort of in a broad picture, the two endangered species in the novel set up two divergent poles of ecological, social, and political meanings. The tiger scenes tend to be associated with violence between humans and non-human species, and with scenarios of displacement, economic inequality, and political oppression, as well as with these conflicts between conservation and social justice. The activities surrounding the dolphins, by contrast, start out in serial mistakes and misunderstandings, but eventually they lead to real and projected scenarios of commitment, collaboration, homecoming, and community building, and at least some redress to economic injustice. So I think what Ghosh is trying to suggest through this juxtaposition is that conservation efforts on behalf of endangered species and efforts to create and maintain social justice are neither inherently at odds nor inherently synergistic. Rather, the novel invites readers to accept that some conservation scenarios throw up really hard choices for environmentalists, and that you can only live up to, in a sense, by developing an ability to see them with the eyes of the community on the ground. In other cases, symbiosis between conservation and social justice offer themselves up easily. And there's also, I think, at the end, an invitation to reflect on what might convert scenarios of the first kind into the second. So both Virunga and The Hungry Tide narratively engage with underlying similar questions, although their styles are obviously very, very different. What are the connections and disjunctures between violence against endangered communities and against endangered species? Whose risk perceptions shape conservation efforts, and what institutional shapes do these efforts take? Who protects and on what authority, and who is assumed to be in need of protection? What causes the kinds of situations in which the protection of non-human species works against the safety of local populations and vice versa? How are local biodiversity protection efforts shaped by regional, national, and international politics? I think the two texts in the end construe somewhat different answers to these questions, but both of them draw on carefully researched political histories in the areas where the plots are set. And it's perhaps no accident that The Hungry Tide, in particular, was written by an author who has a PhD in social anthropology. Anthropologists have recently been at the forefront of re-envisioning relationships between humans and animals in ways that I think directly touch upon issues of conservation and social justice, as well as citizenship. So in anthropology, the idea of multi-species ethnography has been explored, in particular, in the last 5 years. This is a new research area that takes its point of departure from Anat Singh's claim that human nature is an interspecies relationship. And she's quoted in what has come to be sort of the manifesto of this new research area by Eben Kirksey and Stefan Helmreich, among others. And they define the project thus. Ethnographers are now exploring how the human has been formed and transformed amid encounters with multiple species of plants, animals, fungi, and microbes. Rather than simply celebrate multi-species mingling, ethnographers have begun to explore a central question: who benefits, cui bono, when species meet? A little echo of Haraway there, obviously. To answer this question, multi-species ethnographers are collaborating with artists and biological scientists to illuminate how diverse organisms are entangled in political, economic, and cultural systems. So, broadly speaking, the goal of this research area is to reconstruct the understanding of human communities as, in reality, conglomerates of human and non-human species that shape each other. Now, don't want to overstate the case here. This idea is in and of itself not profoundly and absolutely new. And multi-species ethnographers, I think, are only beginning to define the project and what the intellectual sources are. So among them, you might point to Paul Rabinow's earlier concept of biosocialities, Jennifer Walsh's call for a trans-species theory in the context of urban planning, Donna Haraway's meditations on companion species, of course, Anat Singh's investigations of social uses of landscapes and animals and plants in Indonesia, and her recent work on matsutake mushroom culture, and then a long tradition of anthropological, and I might want to add historical, and especially environmental historical studies of animals, animal husbandry, agriculture, and symbolic functions of non-human species. In Belgium and France, Dominique Lestel and Vincent Després have proposed ethnoethnology, ethnoethology, or anthropoethology as new ways of combining the study of human behavior with that of other animals. In Italy, Roberto Marchesini's Zoanthropologia has pursued a related redefinition of the anthropological object of study. And of course, you have people like Philippe Descola and Eduardo Viveros de Castro with their multi-natural perspectivalism, which is probably the most radical form of all this and hard even to integrate into Western knowledge patterns, as Bruno Latour has pointed out, that might complement this. And other theorists have pushed the boundaries very explicitly beyond the question of the animal to other species. So Matthew Hall and Eduardo Cohn have focused on the status of plants and plants as persons and how forests think from 2011 and 2013. So all of these are somewhat in the background. Environmental philosophy has not yet figured quite as prominently in multi-species ethnography. And you might think here of the Australian philosopher Val Plumwood's reflections on interspecies ethics that I think provide another genealogy, although one less invested in ethnography and in cultural difference. And of course, there's a lot of ecofeminist theories and new materialisms that have also addressed relations between species that I think multi-species ethnography has yet really to engage with. What it has engaged with to some extent is philosophical approaches to the question of the animal, from animal welfare to animal rights and critical animal studies. The anthropologist and philosopher Deborah Bird-Rose, whom Sissy already mentioned this morning, has most explicitly made this connection, especially to perspectives informed by continental philosophy in her book Wild Dog Dreaming, Love and Extinction. So this is an exploration of dogs and dingoes in Aboriginal and white communities in Australia that came out in 2011. In that book, she combines environmental thinking and animal welfare thinking and multi-species ethnography. And I think her approach makes clear that the multi-species perspective doesn't just rest on the descriptive claim that this yields a better explanation of human societies. It also relies implicitly or explicitly on the claim that human observers owe non-human species inclusion in such description for ethical reasons, and that kind of inclusion might change relations between humans and non-humans for the better. So there is a very explicit normative dimension also, I think. Or it's not always completely explicit, but it's always there, I think, obviously. Now, Rose makes these ethical implications explicit when she argues that multi-species ethnography ties humans and non-humans together in cross-species genealogies that amount to an extended system of kinship that's accompanied by the ethical obligations of family structures. So she says at one point, life within a system of cross-species kinship is in dreadful peril at this time. The animals and plants that are dying out are not so much vulnerable, endangered, or extinct species, but more significantly are vulnerable and dying members of the family. And I think that sort of metaphorics of the family structure provides an interesting point of comparison with citizenship as a way of thinking about these relations. So, Rose's as well as Singh's work are particularly clear on the fact that these normative dimensions of multi-species ethnography puts it into the vicinity of environmental justice, since it's an anthropology that tries to articulate the claims of humans and non-humans together. But this isn't an unproblematic undertaking, and I think in that their multi-species ethnography is running into some of the same problems that new materialisms have also run into. The flattening of ontologies that comes with questioning the human subject and human-animal boundaries often makes it difficult to address head-on the uneven power distributions that environmental justice is centrally concerned with. So activists for social and environmental justice tend to be acutely conscious of the dangers in emphasizing proximities and kinships between humans and animals, since these kinships have historically often been called upon to legitimate humans. And Rose herself acknowledges as much. She says the power and terror of white Australians' abuse of Aboriginal peoples shows a darker porosity to the West's animal-human boundary, one in which humans are animalized so as to be killed with impunity. So if you take Kerry Wolf, who argues that the human-animal distinction often enables the oppression of humans by other humans, and that once you question that distinction, you help unsettle the oppression, Rose poignantly highlights the dangers of questioning that boundary. So Wolf and Rose would agree that the definition of the animal as a being that can be mistreated without the consequences that would ensue in the mistreatment of a human is at the root of both processes. But then they diverge, and multi-species ethnography seeks to solve this problem by questioning the ontological differences between humans and other species, whereas environmental justice and political ecology typically seek solutions in disabling the power differentials that endow some humans with the authority to categorize others as belonging to the human species or not. So I'm interested in these tensions, not because I think they imply that multi-species theory and environmental justice can't speak to each other. On the contrary, I think they're interesting as a way of exploring how these different theoretical commitments might become mutually productive. And there's a model, I think, for this in colonial and post-colonial confrontations between indigenous societies and European settlers, over relationships to the land. So in Europe and North America in European and North American models of private and public land ownership have been imposed on and been contested in North America, Australia, and other places by indigenous traditions of land stewardship and use. And a culturally aware approach to the conservation of endangered species, I think, could proceed similarly, taking into account different traditions and institutions that shape humans' relationships to other species. So in envisioning what multi-species justice in the context of biodiversity, but also beyond, might look like, multi-species ethnography contributes to environmental justice, I think, in two ways. So first, it shows how interactions with non-human species, and you can go all the way from trees in the forest and seed cultivars to predators, pet animals, and viruses, have shaped particular cultures' way of life and sense of what a good or just life should look like. So to the central preoccupations of environmental justice with land use, resource exploitation, and differential exposure to risk, multi-species theory adds interactions with non-human species and the moral claims these interactions are understood to imply in different cultural contexts. On the other hand, multi-species theory redefines what justice means with a view toward these specific social and cultural contexts. And this is something that sort of appealed to me as a comparatist in approaching that body of work. Rather than assuming that we already know what humans owe other species and what other species owe humans, and how conservation serves the interests of both humans and non-humans, which is, you know, what a lot of that is a lot of the assumption in environmentalism. Multi-species ethnography alerts us to the way in which all of these questions have different responses in different communities. And in turn, I think environmental justice theory and activism highlight how interactions between species and ideas of justice themselves are constantly being reshaped and overwritten by economic interests and power structures. So multi-species justice then is the kind of project that requires a more than human diplomacy, a project that pursues justice with both a sense of cultural differences and a sense of species differences. And so it's in that context, and as a way of concluding, that I think it might be useful to revisit Aldo Leopold's idea of human citizenship in a land community. So when you try to integrate the insights from anthropology, literary studies, and philosophy from the last 2 decades, it might now be time to consider what citizenship in a multi-species community might look like. In other words, a community in which not all citizens are humans. And Leopold already sort of implied that, but I think generalizes a bit too much by including soil and water and such. So the concept of eco-cosmopolitanism that I elaborated in Sense of Place and Sense of Planet, the book that came out in 2008, I already tried to think about citizenship, sort of ecological citizenship beyond national boundaries and cultural differences. But species differences, frankly, didn't form a central part of my considerations then. But I pointed out that there's 2 ways in which something like eco-cosmopolitan citizenship has been envisioned. So on one hand, there's the Habermasian model that Rosie alluded to this morning, sort of membership in transnational aggregations that are sort of conceived of as an expansion of the model of the nation state. And then on the other hand, David Hull's model of global democratic structures that are based on what he thinks of as the cosmopolitan principle of effectiveness. So that would be, you're a citizen according to whether you as an individual are affected by the issue in question and by the principle that you should not be ruled by norms to which you've not given your consent. And I think it's that stakeholder model of citizenship that would be useful when we think about how a multi-species community might be made to work. What if we thought about citizens in any given case as all those whose lives are crucially shaped by the issue at hand? So that means both human and non-human lives. This doesn't mean that all citizens' claims would or could be considered in equal measure. And there may well be reasons why we might want to privilege human over non-human claims in some cases, and there might just be no choice in particular scenarios. But it does mean that all citizens would have an equal right to have their claims considered. So that, I think, would be a meaningful step toward multi-species justice. So in other words, in that way of thinking, citizenship would not be a goal in and of itself, but a means toward gaining a clearer perspective of how justice might be enacted within and across species. Thank you.
Fabulous, fabulous. Bye.
Okay, fascinating talk. Okay, and as a respondent, Professor Rosie Braidotti will give a short talk. She is the Distinguished University Professor at Utrecht University, and she is also the Director of the Center for the Humanities.
Thank you. I'll take the stand. Thank you very much for that wonderful paper, Professor Heise. I take the stand with a certain amount of trepidation, not only because of the density, wealth, and complexity of what you said, but also because it's September 11, I want you to remind you. What better day to talk about human and non-human extinction. And I was very amazed that this morning, actually, nobody even thought about it. It was a very good sign. It means that the scars are healing. Thank you for a paper that shows a wealth and depth of knowledge and a breadth of comparative perspectives that we can all really learn from. If there was any doubts about what the environmental humanities can do, what eco-criticism can contribute, and the specific contribution of literary studies to the grand challenges of today, I think that the work of Professor Ursula Heise is the answer. So I would like our Institute for Sustainability out in the Science Park to take note of work like this and not think for a minute that the issues of sustainability and the future of this planet are a matter only for earth sciences, engineers, and statisticians that can count the carbon traces. The humanities have a major role to play, and we are doing amazing, groundbreaking work. Just see the work of our guests this afternoon and all the distinguished guests of this morning. I was struck by the ease with which Ursula Heise moves from text to world and back again. We have to hold that moment still. It is a major methodological move, one which not many complete departments, including, I suspect, our own, I want to hear what Tom can say about this, would not approve of. Text is text, world is world. What you do when you move from one to the other has to be negotiated very carefully. So this transdisciplinarity and the ease with which it is applied is almost the brand of that major university, which is UCLA, a university where post-colonial theory, feminist studies, environmental studies have long ago broken the boundaries between academia and the world, building in sort of this footbridges to reality that make cultural studies so vibrant and so real. So again, as an ethically driven, highly politicized way of functioning, but the highly politicized part never compromises the actual rigor of the scholarly inquiry, but in fact contributes to it. It is all the more rigorous because it takes in the world and because it dares to go from text to world and back again. And I think this is not even intertextuality. This is really a fundamental material and symbolic semiotic system that allows you to move from one to the other. Well done, again, exemplary, and let's build relationship to the world into our definition of scientific excellence. I think it will be very important. The other crucial point, and that's what I want to engage the most with, but then you can switch me off if I carry on for too long, is that the work of Professor Heise stresses a very crucial and simple point, that the environmental humanities and environmental justice is at heart not a moral issue. I want to hold this still again and repeat. Environmental humanities and environmental justice is at heart not a moral issue. It's a political one. It has to do with power. And this, again, would be the matter for a long and complex debate. But I think that the work of Heise is very clear and very consistent on this. Takes off more in the book than in the paper of today, but it takes up from Foucault's work on biopower. Power of a life, power of living beings. Because I studied with Foucault, you all know how I feel about this. This is a thinker that helps us navigate the waters of the 21st century. He just gets it right. And what he gets right is the critique of the Enlightenment-based subject of liberal individualism, a definition of individualism that locks us into a shape of the subject that prevents us from dealing with the issues of today. It's an obstacle. It is absolutely not a tool that we can work with, particularly as liberal humanism has become, since, of course, in the post-war era, the threshold, the key, the strategic device for massive consumerism. I shop, therefore I am. And I think to understand biopower in a much more diversified, more complex way, whereby we go beyond the boundaries of the self into a set of other premises, I think that is the biopolitical in Foucault and beyond. And this is another discussion, but I can't go into it. It's all of my work, so just read the Posthuman, great book, and I leave it there. I think in Heise's work, the Foucauldian genealogy continues through Paul Rabinow's work that you quote very explicitly, the work on bios, and notably the concept of biosocialities, which means that not being caged by liberal individualism, subjects can relate to human and non-human entities and in networks of biosocial relations. And this writing in of the non-human agents being the technological factor, what we used to call nature, and the indigenous others, is typical of French philosophy. It's what makes French epistemology particularly so very interesting. If you read the teachers of my teachers, Georges Canguilhem on embryology and the making of monsters, and Gaston Bachelard on the role of the imagination in science and the role of matter, the elements in science. So I just want to annotate this is one of the great interesting things about French philosophy, well worth reading. So we're talking about power, biopower, the biopolitical, already multi-species. And I think there are two major issues that the work of Heise raises, and I would like to offer them as a way of starting the discussion. The first issue, and they're of course related, is a hermeneutics of suspicion towards a hasty reformulation of a new humanity, a new we. And because I've also written a lot about this, it resonated with me immediately. We are in this together. A new humanity bonded either in fear of extinction, vulnerability, and we heard this morning also from Cecilia the importance of vulnerability. So a new humanity bonded either in fear of extinction, the vulnerability motif, or in the conviction of its moral stewardship of all other species, the normativity model. So pan-humanity united in fear or in normativity. And it is a suspicion towards this model of power that motivates the investigations of Ursula Heise. We are in this together, yes, but the we is not unitary. And this we is fractured internally by massive power differentials that we are not allowed to forget if we want the environmental humanities to be more than a pastime for the bobos of our metropolitan centers or something that will keep moral philosophers occupied and getting grants for the next 25 years. This is a serious issue. So fractured by internal power differences that need to be looked at power. Examples that Ursula Heise gives, how come so much environmental analysis doesn't take in American foreign policies, a point also that Rob Nixon makes in Slow Violence, Environmentalism of the Poor, the effects of war, the effects of occupation on the territory. How come we only talk about environmentalism in terms of recycling and consumeristic habits? And the even worse is sort of how when environmentalism or eco-criticism becomes a sub-branch of American studies, which has been commented upon extensively. So we are in this together. We need to start from the analysis of that we, grounding it in specific cultural context, grounding it in anthropological, ethnographic observations of how that we is constituted and how the human we relates to other species we. So there is a strong presence of anthropology, multi-species ethnography in your work, which you quote extensively, which is absolutely fascinating. We don't have a strong connection to the anthropology department, but it seems to me that methodologically anthropology is the great winner here. They're coming in with multi-species and they're talking to viruses, they're talking to grasshoppers, they're talking to sort of octopuses. I've seen all kinds of ethnography of multi-species. I wonder how that works. As a philosopher, I think, a bit hippie, but okay, hippies are fine. So there is a danger of a reconstitution of that humanity. First danger. The second related danger that Ursula Heise alerts us to is a danger for the so-called radical epistemologies, feminism, post-colonial theories, environmental studies itself, to flatten out all the differences through over-compartmentalization. So a sense in which we are becoming so specialistic and specialized that it is very difficult to reconcile, and I'm quoting you here, the power differentials that lie at the core of post-colonial theory, the environmentalism of the poor, of environmental justice, human rights advocates, feminists and indigenous rights people, to sort of recombine all of this analysis within the flat ontologies, which in my work becomes the monistic ontologies, neo-Spinozist monistic ontologies that allow us to formulate a common world where we could all actually coexist. I read Deleuze and Guattari as quite simply neo-Spinozism. Neo-Spinozism mixed with the high technology of today, and recomposition of blocks of beings, monistically organized, that allow us to actually talk about human-on-human interaction in a rigorous, cogent manner. But what happens when analysis of the multiple levels of human-on-human interaction becomes so specialistic within the radical epistemologies that actually are being critical of the universalistic, liberal, universal individual model? And I think there is a strong warning in Ursula Heise's work that we do need to find some sort of common grounds, a common language. And I think a great vote of confidence, of faith in the power of literature, in the power of the cultural imaginary to provide what I call the symbolic glue that would allow us for a terminology and a set of theoretical tools that we could all share. So immense generosity in your work, in reaching out and providing tools that we can use across. And then I repeat, a splendid example of what the humanities can do. Thank you very much for it.